I'm Anand. I am CTO and co-founder of Bito, and I like my coffee black, extra strong. Triple shots of espresso with a little amount of water in the morning.
All right, everyone. We are back for another MLOps community podcast. And what a podcast we have today. If you are into LLMs and figuring out how the hell you can get them to work properly, this is just the podcast for you. Anand was so forthcoming on how he spoke about what they're doing at Bito, their AI coding assistant, and how he has gone up against some severe challenges. And they are at this funny place where they don't want to go open source and they don't want to start creating their own GPU racks because that is quite costly. But they are hitting every limit that you can think of when it comes to their API calls. Because of the size and the scale that they're at, they are doing things like using 4 or 5 different APIs. So they're using ChatGPT or 3.5 through the OpenAI API. Then they're also going through Azure, and then they're using OpenAI or ChatGPT. I don't even know how to say it these days, but GPT-4. And then they're using both Anthropic models, and he was super transparent on how they look at which model they're going to hit, and also the load balancer that they've created so that they don't get these rate limits that some of us are very accustomed to. And it's the good old rate limits that will bite you in the butt. He also talked about how important it is to have guardrails, and I thought it was cool to see that he really likes to be super concise with the prompts. And in his mind, the guardrails need to be really, really heavy on the prompting. So on the guardrail side, it was fascinating to see how he put a lot of emphasis in making sure that the prompts are right and you're giving as much context as you can in the prompting side. Tried to dig in and see if he's got a vector database, if they're using any prompting tools, what the actual stack looks like. But for now, they've done it all homegrown and it is open source. So Anand, the CTO of Bito, was incredible and transparent and everything that you would want in an interviewee, because he just opened up the kimono, as they say. Let's get into the whole conversation. And before we do, you know what it is. It means the world to me if you can just share this episode with one person that you think would find it valuable, because sharing is caring. All right, everybody, here we go. Anand, it is great to have you here. I'm excited because you've got quite the track record. You were with a company that went public in the 2000s, and then you were the CTO of a company that got bought recently, more recently, I guess, than the early 2000s, which was in 2021. And now your new endeavor, Bito, is kicking off strong. And so I want to hear about the journey. Like, how did you even get into tech? How did you get to where you're at right now?
So I started straight out of college. I did my master's in computer science from University of Pune, and got the first internship in Veritas, which was completely different role. We were building file systems and volume management, right? How to store bits, bytes, files on, disks. It was very difficult to explain what I'm working on to my friends and my family at that point in time. We knew everybody used us, but, I never got a chance to basically build something that users use right front and center, and they know what it means and how it works and so on, right? So I wanted to kind of try something different, and I was like, since my college days, I was interested in compiler construction. So I left Veritas in 2005, worked on a bunch of products out there, and joined Panta Systems, which was into high-performance computing. They were building great computers, and they needed compilers which can take normal code and then, parallelize it. But as the story goes, they also started working on like storage-related problems. I was back into storage, really wanted to do something different. And that's when I met Amar and Rajiv, along with my then friend Mukul. We started PubMatic, which was completely a different concept. Like it was ad tech, and we are building a platform to, generate more revenue for publishers, the first sell-side platform. 14 years, 15 years later, it went public. I'd say it was a team effort. Learned a lot about scale, data processing, you name it. We are running on low margins, and we have a lot of data and transactions to process. And, after the team effort, we went public. I joined another company known as Eyeota, primarily for two reasons, right? Once you're in an organization that you're founded for, more than 12, 14 years, the problem is over a period of time, although you think you're working, it sometimes feels like you're on the couch. Everybody listens to you. So I wanted to kind of try out something different and also work with people that I don't know and see if I still have it in me to, kind of change the organization or drive change in the organization, make it more performant. And it worked out well. Iota got bought by DNB, but learned a lot on development at that point in time. Where we spend time, there are different types of people, how to kind of push them through and so on. But, learned a lot about technical challenges that everybody faces, right? Once you know the whole platform, it's easy. But when you're going in straight into a different organization, you have to understand the platform. You have to see who's the right choice for issues and modules that you need to build. And Amar and I were thinking over a period of time to build something. That is where we started Bito. And the interesting thing about Bito is we have already pivoted, right? A lot of people don't know, they kind of see us as an AI tool. But we started with a very simple concept of how do we make developers collaborate, right? Because we've been running organizations wherein dev teams are not in one location, right? So even though there was no work from home at that point in time, you had developers in the US, you had developers in Europe, and you had developers in, Asia. And they are all working through the office. The communication is lacking, right? I built this, but, they went home and the other guy doesn't know if it's built or not. They are solving the same problems. Or this code review, which is pending for 2 days just because of time zone issues. So we started with how do you get Slack and Google Doc combination in the IDE, right? We got really good feedback and then figured out nobody's using it. So then, classic case, right? You go talk to people, you figure out what they want, and then you figure out that, they have a lot of requirements, but when it comes to using it, it's really not there where they can use it. And we figured out that most of the people are used to muscle memory of using Slack. They'll copy paste code out there and stuff. Although it's difficult to find and so on, people get used to it. But we started hearing on the requirements about how do I onboard new engineers, right? It's very difficult to explain code. Senior engineers don't want to, spend time, bringing up, it's not that they don't want to spend time. They don't have time because they have to deliver on the product roadmaps, and just sucks energy when they have to go and explain someone that they, kind of can talk about in their sleep, right? In detail. And some people were like, can you auto-generate documents? If somebody has a question, can you automatically answer it? And that is what led us to kind of look at generative AI, right? At that point in time, I'd say GPT-2 was out. It was not really quite there. And then suddenly GPT 3.5 came out, which was awesome because it had reasoning capabilities. It could basically answer on general topics. Although we figured out very early on that it hallucinates quite a lot, right? So it will cook up things. So we had to put some guardrails. But that is where we pivoted and said, hey, what if we built a AI assistant that anybody in an organization can use or a normal developer can use to start getting explanation about the code that exists, right?
Yeah.
And we started with a very simple thing. To test out waters, we built a simple Chrome extension with a single menu option, explain code. That's it, right? And rather than asking people that we knew whether you want to use this or not, we just launched it. Let's see how many people download and use it. And to our surprise, a lot of people actually downloaded it and started using it, which told us that, okay, there is a need for this, right?
Yep.
And then we immediately launched our extension on Visual Studio Code as well as JetBrains as a personal assistant, which actually helps you generate code, explain code, write test cases, and so on. And that's what led us into this area, and we've been basically expanding.
So you started out and you had this deep desire for optimization and you went into the compilers. You then were trying to optimize companies, and now it feels like you're optimizing developers in a way. And so I see a theme there that's coming through. It's quite nice. How much of this whole optimization piece do you feel like you are still trying to tackle? And are you doing things on these lower levels right now where it's like, I know that before we hit record, you said, oh yeah, you have some GPUs lying around the office, and are you tinkering, trying to parallelize and optimize at those levels? Where are you at right now? What do you get into for fun in this optimization level?
So the fun aspect is trying to figure out, OpenAI, Anthropic, and all these guys, are running huge models, right? Tons of GPUs. And sometimes when you're answering questions related to a particular topic, or say, for example, your own code, do you need that bigger model, right? So can I actually, have an open source model, which is, rather than saying training, providing context on what I have right now, and can it answer questions relatively well on lower cost, right? And the primary reason for doing this is not just basically saving on cost, but in the future or even right now for enterprises, everybody's worried about data going to LLM models, right? And it depends upon whether you remember to fill the form, don't use my data for training and stuff. If somebody forgets it, then your data is going out there. Obviously, it's not going to be publicly published, but nobody wants their hard-earned IP to be there with someone, right? So most of the people are enterprises, and some people who are worried about their code are more interested in, can I actually have something that I can host locally in my data center, right? We are not really there right now. There are models which you can run, people say on your laptop and stuff. But the thing is, if you run it and you try to ask questions and get answers, it's not really there. It's not basically returning your answers in the time that you'd be happy with, right? It will return your answers, but you'll go grab a cup of coffee and come back. That's not how it works. So, but I'm trying to figure out, what are the tricks out there? Can I optimize, fine tuning, right? We are not kind of using fine tuning right now, but our idea is at some point in time we'll need to fine tune some models. So learning about it, testing waters. So that is what tinkering I'm doing right now, I'd say. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like you're using a whole suite of models, and whether or not, so are you basically saying you're going to try all the different APIs as a service, like the OpenAIs and the Anthropics and Coheres, whatever it may be, and you're trying to also leverage the open source stuff that's out there?
Yes. So we are leveraging open source, I would say, for embeddings right now. The models out there that we would like to use to answer questions, we need to host a lot of GPUs, right? For a startup at our current stage, it's not feasible, right? So we'd be using, I'd say, commodity APIs, as I call them right now. So you have OpenAI, you have Anthropic. You also can get OpenAI through Azure, right? Within your VPC. Amazon has come up with Bedrock, and Amazon has its own models. So does Google. And early on, when we started building the extension, and we saw a steep increase in usage, and we had one OpenAI account at that point in time, and we started hitting TPM and RPM limits left and right. And obviously, they're a small team also, right? OpenAI is expanding. They're a good technical team, small team, and really focused. That said, if you make requests to basically increase your TPMs and RPMs, if it's small enough, they'll do it. But most of the time,
good luck.
At some point in time, they come back and say, that's the max I can give you. So, you need to have, fallback options, right? So what if you hit 3.5 limits? What if you hit GPT-4 limits? What if you hit, Anthropic limits, right? So we actually, built a simple mux, demux, and load balancer, right? So what we do, and this is not like, anybody who goes into this problem will actually build something like this, right? So,
Yeah.
we have multiple accounts, right? And you basically have different TPM and RPM limits on them. You need to decide anytime the request comes in, do you have enough TPM and RPM to handle this request, and which account I should use, right? So if you're using like just one LLM, then, you can utilize that mechanics. Obviously, you can't have a huge number of accounts with one, right? It has to be relatively enough so that those guys are okay, you are okay, and then you have to manage costs across all of those because you have your credit cards being charged. And then if you have issues, models do go down, right? And people are okay with that because it's a new technology and things can go wrong. So nobody's like upset. But at the same point in time, somebody who's trying to get an answer right now, if he doesn't get it, he's pissed. So you need to kind of make sure that, okay, if one model is not working, which is the next best model that I can use, right?
Yeah.
So we need like options to fail over within multiple accounts, say OpenAI Direct, OpenAI with Azure, right? Can I fail over between those two? And this two at runtime. And then if these two are not available, can I use Anthropic? And then Anthropic has multiple models. You have Instant, you have Claude. Claude is pretty fast, but it's fast and furious sometimes, right? Like it doesn't give you the right answer. And if you use Claude 2, it's great. At the same point in time, it takes slightly longer time to understand things, and
it's so much bigger.
The answers are and the costs are different, right? So you have to manage those aspects. So when you look at all of this, one is like, how do you make it highly available? How do you make sure that when a request comes in, you're basically using external APIs which can be up and down. So identify which one is live and whom should I send it to based on the request that is coming, based on the size of the request. Because if it can fit into 4K, I can give 3.5 a request. Or if it basically goes to 16K now, I have 3.5, it supports 16K. But if it is more than 16K, I need to use either GPT-4 or I need to use Claude. So, you need to do that switch. And at some point in time, you need to also degrade the functionality. For example, there's nothing else available beyond like GPT 3.5. If the actual question was less than 4K, then you say, okay, I'll reduce the context that I give it, but I'll try to answer the question as much as possible. So a lot of things actually go in. When people say using LLM is simple, when you're kind of creating a solution that, is generally available, there are a lot of hoops that you have to jump across to actually make that happen. Yeah.
And it feels so janky that you have to do it like that. It's like such a hacked way to make it work. And I guess it's a testament for how popular these models are, because with all the money that's being thrown at OpenAI and Anthropic, they still can't service the traffic that they have and the demand that there is, which is incredible to me. But there's also this idea of the evaluation of the models. And you talked a bit about that. You kind of touched on it. It feels like you're looking at a few things. I am guessing you have like the gold standard model that you're always going to try and hit 3.5 if you can, because that's fastest, cheapest, and most accurate or best out there. Or at least it was, but I don't know, like every once in a while they update it and it's a little bit like, I think an open source model might be better than this right now, and then they have to re-update it or whatever, but that's a whole nother story. And so when you're looking at the evaluation, you have, okay, does it fit into this 4K context? Then I'm going to try and hit 3.5. If it doesn't, I'm going to try and maybe hit GPT-4, but I have to be wary of a few things. A, it's going to be much slower, and then B, it's going to be much more costly. And the same goes with Anthropic. If you start throwing it over there, do you have a rough idea of like the decision tree on which model it needs to hit and how that decision is being made?
So primarily, right now we do kind of manage cost, right? That is like, I'd say the last priority to look at, because you're basically trying to make sure that the user gets what they want. So primarily it is based on a couple of things, right? Size of the input. Can I process the input with the algorithm? And then which algorithm is good for it? So for example, if you're asking normal question and you have a big chat history, I'd like to give as much context as possible, because sometimes when you're generating code, you ask a question, you get the code, you want to make modifications. So you're asking questions based on the context, right? So I'd like to keep that context as much as possible. So out there, based on the context size and your prompt size, I would pick a model. That's the first thing. But the second thing, which is again important, is the model okay for answering that question? So for example, if I'm using GPT-4, I'll get better answers. It's better at reasoning, right? If I use GPT 3.5, it's good. But at the same point in time, there are certain things that it will hallucinate more on, or it won't give you proper output. A very simple example would be, give me a shell command to do X. And it will give you a shell command and also print a lot of blurb about like how to use it and so on. But sometimes if people want to actually do something like, I would like to ask you a shell command to list something, and I just want to get the output of the shell command. I want to parse it out and run it. Just not possible, right? But if you basically use GPT-4 and you give proper instructions in the prompt, you can do that, right? So depending upon the instructions and the use case, you need to basically decide whether this particular model is okay, or even if some model is costly, you need to move to that, right?
Yeah.
Now, we recently supported AI that understands your code, which is we index your code. We generate context, right? And LLMs are very good at answering generic questions, but then you can basically put some guardrails saying that this is it. This is the context. Using this context, answer this question, right? So I need to generate that context. That context can be huge. I can't use GPT-4, right? I have to basically go to Claude 2 so that I can give as much context as possible. And what we figured out is even that is not enough sometimes, right, to answer the question concretely. So number one is size. Number two is the kind of operation that you're doing, and is the model good enough to actually handle that? These two become primary, I'd say, constraints based on which you decide the model. And obviously, you have a map to degrade the functionality. Like, if I don't have TPMs on GPT-4, like, okay, the next best is 3.5. I don't have out there, then I'll basically switch to Claude, right? And that degradation is based on then the lowest denominator, which is like the cost, right, from the user's perspective. So those are the ways we kind of deal with it.
All right, let's take a minute to talk about our sponsors, Weights and Biases. It seems like everyone's working on large language models right now, but understanding what to build with LLMs and how they work under the hood can be tricky. Thankfully, Weights and Biases can help. You might know about Weights and Biases' flagship experiment tracking product. In the LLM space, teams like OpenAI and Cohere rely on Weights and Biases to train and debug their models, but Weights and Biases has plenty more to offer you if you're thinking about training, fine-tuning, or prompt engineering an LLM on your own. Weights and Biases Traces lets you uncover granular insights about your LLMs, providing a visual representation of their execution flows, color-coded by each component in the chain. This helps you understand each step your LLM takes on its way to generating its output, giving you a deep, nuanced view of its behaviors and letting you iterate and debug much more quickly. Weights and Biases LLM production monitoring enables the creation of custom dashboards to monitor your LLM activities in real time, including throughput, token usage, cost, latency, and errors. That sounds so good. And if you need help getting started with Weights and Biases, they can help too on that front. They've released multiple free classes for machine learning communities like ours, the MLOps community, teaching them how to build LLM apps intelligently, approaching prompt engineering, and a whole lot more. Whether you're a seasoned pro or just getting started on your LLM journey, you can find what you need at Weights and Biases. You can get started today going to 1db.me/MLOps_traces. for free today. Get after it. wandb.me/MLOps_traces. Let's get back into the podcast. Well, and now walk me through the other pieces in the stack that you have, because I imagine at some point you're doing some retrieval augmented generations too. So Is there a vector database in there? And you mentioned guardrails. What kind of, are you using tools for these guardrails? How are you making sure that there are not hallucinations? And what other tools are you using to help you just have the best answers that you can, and really the more confidence that you can have when you are letting these users say, tell me what this means, or give me this shell script like you were saying earlier?
So, it's the first question about what is the stack that we're using for, AI that understands your code. So do we use vector database? The answer is currently, we use like our own homegrown, I would call it a vector database, but, a map in memory. We'd be soon moving to a vector database. The reason why we actually did that is the current implementation that we have. We want to make sure that users' data stays on that machine, right? So we don't index and move anything to our server side. We don't touch your code and we don't move anything to our server side. So we wanted something which actually installs as an IDE extension, right? Indexes stuff directly on your machine. So the index file is stored on your machine. And in memory, I need the same mechanics of something like, say, Pinecone, for example, right? Insert, upsert, and so on. So we built up one small layer on top of it that we utilize, which is in memory, right? Then it again has its own restriction, right? Because all these guys, if you're running it within the IDE, depends upon whether you're running it within, a web view. If it's within a web view, you have a limitation of 512 MB, a lot of restrictions. So you have to make sure that, first of all, I'll support very basic case. I don't believe that repositories will be, or, I don't support repositories which are over 120 MB, right? Let's start with that. Now, if you take that repository, if you're going to index, and we are not a code search company to start with, right? So, we are going to add symbol search as we go ahead. But right now we have embedding based indexes, and those embeddings are vectors. Those numeric vectors, when you load it in memory, is smaller in size, but when you store it on a file system, it kind of increases the size, sometimes by 3x, right? So your index might be more than your code. So we use in memory because we don't want people to install something more. But over a period of time, what we are looking at is, can I basically have a vector database, which is easy to install, available as a library? And if there is none, then we'll have to build one, depending upon how soon we hit those kind of limits. But on the server side, ideally we'll use one which will basically, we've tested Pinecone, a bunch of others, but we'll use one which is can be hosted locally, can scale up and scale down. We do use, but it's homegrown, I would say, just for the use cases that we need.
Makes total sense. Yeah, and that's a whole nother can of worms that I bet you have to work through, is how to ensure privacy when you've got this, and make sure that people are okay with you knowing all of their code, especially for these non-open source projects. And if they're going to ask you questions, they have to be willing to, I guess, give up a bit of privacy, because maybe you're not doing anything with a vector database, but you are sending the code to one of these companies, these API companies. And so I guess that's where the beauty of getting local or open source models comes into play later on down the line. But what about, I don't want to skip over the idea of, what about the tools for the guardrails? Are you using anything there? And how are you assuring that the output is actually valid or not hallucinated?
I'd say that we are not 100% there, right? It still hallucinates. At the same point in time, the guardrails that we have in place, we are not using any kind of tool right now. But tools that you use will be based on certain use cases. I'll go into one. But right now what we're doing is we're looking at the answers that we are getting, right? Sometimes people basically put a thumbs up and thumbs down, right? Which also means that, they would like to share some data with Bito saying that, hey, this is the case, this didn't really work. Wherein, we basically have the context of, what was there from the index and what answer was given. Or sometimes if there is a hallucination, actually figure out why is there a hallucination, right? And most of the times, as LLMs are very good, but, similar to any computer program, garbage in, garbage out. If you don't ask the right question, you don't get the right answer, right? And if you have a natural language interface, then people will ask anything because they think they're asking the right thing, but they haven't given enough context or enough nuggets to LLM to basically figure out what is it that you want to get answers to. So when we get something like that, then we look at, do I need to change the prompt that I have, or I need to put some extra rules for it to actually answer? And then we update the rules accordingly. And then periodically we keep on running tests on the model so that we keep on updating that checklist. That is what we're doing right now. But I'll take another use case, for example, right? So say that you want to do security analysis of your code, right? And you want to basically check for open source vulnerabilities. Now, if you only use LLM, it's going to give you some data. It's not going to say, I'm not going to tell you what security issues are there. It will give you some security issues. Some security issues are based on the data that it has been trained on, and some it will hallucinate. But out there, the right approach would be to actually take and run a open source vulnerability tool, right? Which is very easy, right? Don't use rocket science. This is available today. Just scan the code. You get the output from open source vulnerability tools. Once you get that, then feed it as a context to LLM and say, these are the vulnerabilities. Tell me where this occurs. And, or it also has the information of where these are. Now tell me how to fix it, right? That is a better implementation wherein, you're already putting guardrails in place, right? Using tools which are deterministic, right? Not basically just depending upon generative AI in that scenario, right? So that is how you put some guardrails. And I would say hallucination is there, but sometimes I believe hallucination is a necessary evil, because if it just answers based on whatever it knows and, just repeats what it knows, then it's not generating something new, right? So, it's like you're telling somebody read this book and just answer from within this book. He's not going to think beyond that. We want it to think beyond that, right? So it's a necessary evil, but people are trying to actually utilize it to get context and answers on something that is existing. And the only problem is nobody's it's not trained enough. It's trained enough, but it's not trained enough to basically go and say, if I'm talking about something which is existing, let me go and verify, right? Using existential information, what I'm saying is right or wrong, right? And it will come in the future because, over a period of time, we were nowhere there. Now we have something which can actually answer. So now it's like a kid. You have to train and put some guardrails so that, it starts behaving properly over a period of time.
Well, I like this idea that you're really on the prompt side. You're trying to figure out everything you can do before feeding the question or the context to the LLM. And so you're trying to say, hey, can we solve this with heuristics? Can we solve this some other way? And then give that to the LLM. Or maybe you just don't even need to end up giving it to the LLM and you can just get your answer and you're good.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's nice that it's looking at it on the prompt side as opposed to looking at the output and seeing what the output is. And I guess you're getting flagged when you get those hallucinations with the thumbs up, thumbs down, and it feels like that you've got a human in the loop that goes and is manually trying to evaluate what happened, which is another one. I think that's pretty on par for what we've been hearing. And I bring this up because we have a whole survey out right now that's all around LLM evaluation and how people are doing it and what they're doing. And so I think the thumbs up, thumbs down is a huge one. And then getting a human in there and figuring out where things went wrong is another one that is, these are very clear indicators of trends that people are doing right now. And so it's what we're using. I don't know if it's perfect. I don't think it's perfect by any means. I should clarify that, but it's like you said, it's nice that it's a necessary evil sometimes, and you got to work with it.
Yeah. And sometimes, why I say it is a necessary evil is because, think about this, right? You don't have an API. You're kind of like just giving your concepts to the LLM to get an answer. Like, hey, I want to build this and I want to have an API. And, it will generate an API for you, right? And sometimes people are like, give me an answer. This API doesn't exist. But, if you look at it the other way around, somebody who's actually trying to build something gets an API designed just because somebody else needed. Now it's like, okay, now I have an API design, let me implement it this way. So there are two sides of the coin, right? Depends upon like, if you're basically like, somebody's like, I want to make changes to an existing code. Out there, that answer is wrong. But if somebody's kind of generating new code and wants that idea, that answer is right. But the LLM basically is going to answer based on what it knows and the context that you've given and the guardrails. So if those things are not proper, right, the same answer can be wrong for one, but right for another. So that's the interesting aspect here.
Not to get too philosophical, but that is awesome to think about. The other piece that I was wondering about, because prompts are so important for you, and you mentioned your testing prompts, how are you tracking prompts? How are you testing these prompts? Are you using a tool on that side?
So right now, we don't use any tool on that side. We are checking out a lot of open source tools that are out there, which can basically run prompts on different inputs, look at the outputs, and then basically check them or verify them. Our main issue is with the verification piece. How do you verify something that you don't know what the answer is? Because like even human in the loop, right? Say that I'm basically looking at a technical question. There are a few people who are familiar with, Rust is basically picking up, but that's it. There are a lot of Java guys who are not familiar with Rust. Now, if I'm having him verify it, he human in the loop is also incapable sometimes. And then when you depend upon the LLM, the thing is, it can hallucinate when it's basically matching the results, right? So, that's why what we have is we have based on all the thumbs up, thumbs down, whatever we get, plus, some test scenarios that we create and the data that we generate, we basically try to figure out what is the right possible set of answers, and then basically test prompts on those so that, the test results are pre-crafted, verified, so that we don't depend upon AI generating an answer and AI testing it with what it thinks is right. We've kind of figured that can cause a serious issue, wherein, like the normal human thing, right? Or like, you want something to be right, so you think about it, and then, you basically come up with all the reasons why that is right. We don't want to have the same thing happen with like our testing process. So we run it. So it's a homegrown tool, but at the same point in time, I would not say that it's just perfect by any means. And we also get inspired by like the open source tools which are built out there. Some people kind of put some novel ideas, and then we are like, okay, how do we bring this concept to our tool? So that is how we're kind of doing it currently. But I believe that some of these tools which are kind of working in that direction over a period of time will solve for those problems. So we don't have to kind of deal with it. They're progressing pretty well. But that said, there's this gap that we think, needs to basically be filled before it can be used as something that you can use in production on a daily basis.
Yeah, we had the creator of Airflow who also created Apache Preset and also created Promptimize recently on the podcast. And that's one of them. That's why I was asking, because he was very much talking about how, yes, we need to test our prompts and we need to look at it like you have test-driven development, and now this is prompt-driven development. And I like that idea. I do know that there are a lot of companies that are trying to tackle this, and each one is going at it in a different way. And there's still a lot left to be desired because, again, everyone is doing it in their own flavor. And so it's not quite like you can have one tool that solves problems for everyone.
Yeah. And I think, say 1 year, 2 years down the line, right? Because these companies are like everybody, say Airflow guys and other guys are going to build homegrown solutions. There'll be open source solutions. And There might be 10 problems that we need to solve. Somebody's solving 5, and these guys are, kind of focused on like their 1 or 2 problems, like us.
Yeah.
When you basically look a year down the line, all these problems now become common problems. And then you have solutions at different places. Then you can combine and create one, or at least that knowledge is there. So nobody has to reinvent the wheel, but, kind of put all of these things together. So it is just going to get better from here on, I'd say. Yeah.
Completely. What are some other prompting best practices that you've found? I imagine you've been doing a lot of it over the last couple months, trying to figure out, are you prompting 3.5 and how that differs than when you prompt 4, or when you're prompting Anthropic, or when you're prompting a Llama model? Like, how do you deal with all of that complexity?
So, we start with something like a base model, prompt, I would say. Run it on 3.5, and you're kind of tuning it to get a certain result. Then you kind of run it on, GPT-4. Most of the times it will run perfectly fine on GPT-4, but sometimes you have to tweak it. GPT-4 is very good at structured prompting. What we figured out, if you give a JSON or, YAML kind of, a structured format, structured like rules, then it's very good at evaluating those. Now, if I put the same thing in 3.5, there are certain things that it won't do properly. For example, like as I said, it's going to give you some blurs that you don't want, and you have to do a bunch of things to actually remove that, right? Sometimes you just say that that's enough prompting. I'll basically put like hardcore logic to just pick up things. I'll put markers. I'll give a prompt so that it put markers so that I know I have to just pick these things using the markers and remove the other things, right? You have to do that. At some point in time, people are like, that's enough prompting. In case of Anthropic, also it's the same thing. Like, if you use a GPT-4 prompt directly in Anthropic, it won't give you the same result. So you have to change the prompt. So for any given option, to be very frank, we have for every LLM a separate prompt. Right.
Oh, wow.
It's like you can share the prompt if it works, but most of the times you have tweaks which are very specific to that LLM so that it works properly. So it might be the same question, but you're running 3 different prompts on 3 different LLMs. And those are tested because every time they update the learning, they update the version, you figure out that certain things are not matching. Some of the prompts work, simple prompts work, but some of the prompts you need to change those. Because the output may not be what you expect, or sometimes suddenly you have to add another rule. So I wouldn't say that, the same prompt works across all. We have to maintain like a prompt repository, if I may say so, for different things. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You have to really look at how each LLM likes to be spoken to. They're very finicky in that way. And so I look at that and I think about, basically the prompt engineering and the prompt design that you have and the complexity that you add when you add a new model. And it's almost like one thing that's becoming really clear to me right now is how, unless you absolutely have to, you're adding so much more overhead by bringing on a new model that it's better if you can, if you're not like hitting a certain scale and you don't absolutely have to, then you don't need to go out and use other models, because you just have to start thinking about all these new things like, okay, when do we use this? What's the cost of it? How's the prompts? What do they need to be looking like? And all of that is bringing on just unneeded complexity if you're not at that scale.
Yeah. Means like, I would say that, if your scale is not huge, pick one model and get comfortable with it. If your scale is huge, you will end up with TPM and RPM. And then again, at that point in time, try to see if you can work with a couple of models. Obviously, be on the lookout for, new models so that you can see if I need to replace something in the near future. But, if you're beyond that, then you have to deal with, all of these issues, I would say, whenever you bring up a new model. And then the other thing is, we didn't talk about latency, right? So, although these models work, depending upon how much load is there on the platform, your results might vary between, I'm getting a result in a second to I'm getting a result in 10 seconds to I'm getting a result in 15 seconds, or after 15 seconds, kaput, no results. So
Timeout.
that is another thing, and that happens in real time, right? You don't have control over it. So, and things will improve because there is a big shortage of GPUs, right?
Yeah.
But, as they improve, I think these will be problems that, people won't think about maybe 2 years, 3 years down the line. But right now, those are challenges as you scale. Yeah.
It's so funny. I was thinking about that when you were talking about the prompting and how you need to have a special prompt for each model. And it's like, man, this does not feel like the future.
Yeah.
This, in Minority Report, I did not see Tom Cruise having to pull his hair out because he had to figure out the different prompts for each super smart AI, Like, that does not feel like the future at all. And hopefully we figure that out in some way, shape, or form. But the other thing that I was going to ask along these lines are, I'm sure you've done the cost-benefit analysis of buying a bunch of GPUs or just renting GPUs from some of these GPU providers. What did that look like? Because you're at this really interesting place where you've got a ton of scale, so you're hitting the rate limits on the APIs, but you said earlier that it doesn't make sense for us to do the GPUs because those are really expensive. So how did that whole cost-benefit analysis look, and what made you ultimately opt for the APIs?
Yeah. So, I'd say that the cost-benefit analysis that, anybody does, right, holds for that point in time. So in the future, this might change. Right now, I'd say we are at a scale wherein, getting GPUs will be more costly, because if I get GPUs, it can handle more than what I need to. But then for high availability and other things, I need to keep those GPUs up and running, which is like an extra cost. Here, I'm basically paying on as need basis, right? And I believe that some of these LLM providers are discounting cost, right? If you look at the amount of money that they're spending versus what they're making, it will take some amount of time for them to actually recuperate the cost, but they have enough funding. Somebody like us, if I spend all of that, buying GPUs, then I'll be slow on like product development and resources. So that's the reason I would say. And giving like a typical cost, if you buy a machine on Amazon with good GPUs, yeah, I'd say with good amount of RAM, 64 GB, and having 4 GPU cards or something like that, I can easily run up to like $340 a day on a single machine, right? Now you'll need a cluster of those. So, and then you need to basically, one is you get the GPUs, you deploy the model. That is one aspect. Even if you're not fine-tuning the model. A lot of people talk about fine-tuning, but fine-tuning, I would say, is not that easy. And then you have to do a lot of fine-tuning to actually see the results, right? That's the reality. Forget about like Twitter and YouTube videos. But then the other cost that comes into picture that people don't think about is you need to have DevOps or data center guys managing that hardware, making sure that it is highly available. If something goes down, you have to basically bring it back up, right? You want to manage all of that complexity right now, which is additional cost, right? So one is machine, putting the model, making sure that it works, and your engineers are focused on that, and then you have to do the high availability. So there is people, GPU, maintenance, and management cost. And if something goes wrong, you can only blame yourself. You have APIs, one model doesn't work, you can switch immediately. By the time, you're that big that where you can do that other piece, that is the time when you'll basically go and say, okay, now I'll basically use my own data center, I'll use my own GPUs, and I'll basically load up an open source model, train it properly, and then use it. But, there's always a stage. We are not at that stage right now. But you have to factor in all that cost. It's not only, deploying the model and bringing it up. It's like maintaining it, updating it, running it, making it highly available. So the cost goes up, the management and maintenance also goes up.
That is a wise way of looking at it. I completely see your perspective, because we talk a lot about that, especially with the ML 1.0, as some people call it. The build versus buy decision is a very, very common question that comes into play. And for a lot of it, it would be like, well, why do I need a specific pipeline tool? I can just use this off the shelf open source tool, and I don't need to have some managed service. And really, in the beginning, you can get really far if you just let someone else deal with those complexities and you deal with your special sauce. And you deal with, as you said, it's almost like you glossed over it. You're very much focused on the product right now. You're not focused on the other crap that's around it, like networking GPUs together or fine-tuning models that are open source models, and who knows how well that actually goes, and getting the data, labeling the data, cleaning the data, all that stuff that you have to do. And all of a sudden you hire a few researchers, ML researchers from Facebook, and boom, your costs skyrocket again.
Yeah. And then you're burning money.
Yep.
And you're not delivering things to people, right? Like results, right? So I think there is always this tussle. But again, as I said, it's a point in time, right? Like over a period of time, as the things shift, then, it becomes more viable to have your own, right? And in some cases, it is a requirement for an enterprise, for example, right? We are not we are a startup, but for an enterprise which is trying to bring this in-house, security is primary concern. So, they will start with that as the base thing. Like, I want it in-house. Then you can do the other stuff, right? So it all depends upon your requirements, your perspective. But yeah, for a startup or anybody who's trying to use it, I'd say, start with whatever is out there in the market. First, make sure that you are able to build and get what you want. Then you can optimize, right? Otherwise, you're spending time and you don't even know whether you'll get to what you want to get to in the first place. Yeah.
Well put. Well, last question I've got for you is, you've been knee-deep in AI coding assistants and learning how to interact with them and also make sure that they do what you want them to do. What are some best practices that you've found when it comes to debugging with your little code assistant next to you that can help you along the way?
I would say that whenever you're using any kind of coding assistant or even LLMs in general, right? It doesn't need to be like, some people use ChatGPT, some people can directly use Anthropic, Chat, and so on. I would say first thing is assume that LLM is there and can answer generic questions, but it doesn't know everything and it doesn't know exactly what you want. So as much context you can provide, I think context is very important, right? So if you're asking issue related to, or you got a exception and you're trying to figure out how to fix it, you can paste the exception out there, and based on the exception information that a human being can also read, but most of the people have forgotten because now it's very easy. Like, you put a debugger and it shows you what line. It's going to basically go through it, understand it, and then explain you what that exception means. And in most of the exceptions you have, this line has an exception. And then typically, based on the learning that it has, it will say this might have caused this. Most of the times it is 70, 75%, 80% there. In some cases it is not there. That is because it has generic context, not the context which is your context, your code. So if you have anything that you can provide for it to give you a better answer, provide that as a context. Like, hey, this is the file, this is the code that I was running. I'm seeing an exception in this particular code. Here's the code, right? And this is the exception that I'm getting. And this exception is happening when so and so things happen, right? Then you will get better results. Otherwise, you're going to get results which may hit the mark or may be totally off the mark, right? But in case of exceptions and the other pieces, most of the information is out there. Most of the times, 80%, 85% is out there, and you'll be able to solve the issue. But for complicated cases wherein you have services which are running and things can happen in a runtime and you're seeing an exception, providing that additional context always helps. And if you don't have the context, then it can hallucinate. It can do a bunch of things. Even sometimes with context, it can hallucinate if your question is not right. Another way to put it is, experienced developers who know how to code, what is written, and the overall thing would be able to derive more better results than people who don't know anything, right? Because they now know, it's like you need to know something to ask the question, right? Like, hey, let me describe you, this is the situation that I'm in and this is what I'm seeing. What do you think is the issue? Versus, I'm seeing this issue. What do you think is the issue, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I'll say is very important. So although we say that a non-programmer can become a programmer, yeah, to a certain extent for simple examples. But if you're doing complicated stuff, the guy who's asking the question needs to make sure that he has to logically provide the context that can actually help answer the question in another way, right? So yeah, sometimes I call it oxymoronic, but yeah.
Nothing about this shit makes any sense to any of us. So I like how that you've been able to find a few patterns and you've been kind enough to share them with us. This is awesome, Anand. For anybody that is interested and wants to try out Bito, we'll leave the link in the description. And I think that's it for now.
Thank you, Dimitrios. This was a great conversation, to be very frank.